Welcome to the Fantasy Champions Fantasy Football Podcast. Here's your host, Morgan Colby and Rick Lemon.
What's going on, Fantasy Champs? Yeah. We got some stuff to get to on this show. Before we do that, be sure to like, subscribe on YouTube. Check us out on all podcasting platforms. Comment down below on any of the platforms you can comment on. Be sure to like us and follow us on all social media platforms. It helps the show. It helps us. But welcome into the podcast. So excited to have you. Today we're going to talk about, we're going to do a little recap of the top 12, top 24 running backs from the 2024 or 2023 fantasy football season. I've been focusing on 2024, but the 2023 fantasy football season, where they finished, what happens, what happened, what the expectations are. So we're doing a little bit of a 2023 recap on this episode. We have other content coming at you next week. I think at some point we will do, we're trying to change up some of the content this year. So, so it's not stale and the same, but I do want to do something with some consistency charts and ranking to see who the most consistent guys are, because, you need those steady eddies in your lineup who get you fantasy points on a week-to-week basis in pretty consistent fashion to win your league, as well as the guys that explode. So it's a fine balance. It's a fine balance. So we will be talking about that, recapping a little bit more of the season. But in this episode, we're going to recap the running backs for 2024. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the last episode where we talked about our top 5 guaranteed running backs for the 2024 season. Should be an interesting run through, but I'm going to take you through the top 12. And so without further ado, let's hop in. Let's hop into this. So like I said, I'm going to mainly talk about the top 24. The top 24. We're doing, just to let you guys know, if you're watching on YouTube, we're doing weeks. If you're watching on YouTube and if you're listening on the podcast, we're doing weeks 1 through 17 because those are the fantasy football weeks. Week 18 don't matter to me at all. So we're gonna track those weeks in these recaps. As the offseason goes along, we might just include week 18 because it's just a week where people could have scored fantasy points. So we'll do that. Excuse me, it's late. I'm watching the San Francisco 49ers and the Packers game right now. So you're going to get this content on Sunday before the football games, but you can watch it whenever. It's still, it fits the mold for the whole season. So, or the whole offseason, I should say. But yeah, so we're going to move to the running back position and talk about a few things. I actually want to check something because I may have screwed this up. I may have screwed this up on the calendar. Last time we did wide receivers, I believe, but I feel like I talked about running backs just recently. Either way, all right, let's do running backs. So we have the number one guy, Christian McCaffrey, had 391 fantasy points. Oh, that's why I talked about it on the Bold Prediction show. So if you saw that show, you know what I'm about to say. But Christian McCaffrey right now he finished as the running back 1 in fantasy football. He had 391 fantasy points, and he had 200. The next closest guy, who was Travis Etienne, we'll talk about in a second, had 268. So McCaffrey finishes the season consistent. He finishes the season with some pretty big explosion weeks, and he finishes the season really strong through 17 weeks with 390, like 130 plus fantasy points more than the next closest competitor. So I think whatever this is it was a uber impressive season for him at the running back position. But there is a trend beneath him that I've noticed, and I think that trend is worth diving into, because after him, I mean, you can go all the way down to like the guys that are at 206 fantasy points, and they're only 54 points off of the leader, and some of these dudes, missed a couple of weeks. So, obviously we'll talk about those guys, but it was a weird season. It's the running back position to me in PPR leagues and in standard, in half PPR formats, not standard leagues, but they're becoming less and less valuable as time goes along, because I guarantee if you switch this to standard, McCaffrey would still be the running back 1 in fantasy football, but And I actually look at that, because hey, who knows? Maybe we got some standard people listening to our podcast. But he had 324 fantasy points, which puts him 80 off Raheem Mostert. And the numbers change significantly. But in standard leagues, the numbers drop significantly from the RB2 all the way down. So it's better to have one of the top running backs. Whereas in PPR, I mean, is it really that important to have one of the top running backs in fantasy football? So we'll be talking about that as the offseason goes along. We do have a top 5 lessons learned from the fantasy football season that I'm going to bring you next week at some point, and it should be really, really intriguing and really interesting because I've kind of pivoted a little bit off of some of the talking points, I guess, that I've had over the last couple of years, and how drafting a running back early is important because positional differentiation and the guys who finish at the top are really, really high, and the guys who finish at, there's always a massive point differential between the RB12 and the RB 2 or 3, and this year there just wasn't. So I think that's more due to the fact that the ball is getting spread out more, but I'm gonna have some stuff to talk about on the lessons learned episode that is going to kind of maybe change my approach as the offseason comes along and we go into the regular season for 2024 and get ready for fantasy football for 2024. So stick around for that. But Christian McCaffrey had an electric year. I don't know if he's going to be able to continue it going into next year, but I still think he's a top 3 running back in fantasy football. And I think he'll probably be drafted as the running back 1 off the board, and maybe as the number 1 player off the board next year, even though he's 29 and he's getting older. Excuse me. All right. Number 2 was Travis Etienne. Like I said, he had 268 fantasy points, had a really, really good season, did have some bust weeks in here. Like he had a 6-point week in week 2. He had a 10. Week 10, he had a 6-point game. Week 11, he had an 8-point game. Week 15, he had a 9-point game. And week 16, he had a 6-point game. So he had several bust weeks involved in this situation on the season. But overall, I feel like he did have a really good NFL season. He scored a lot of touchdowns. He was actually one of the top scoring running backs for the first half of the season. And then after the bye week, he kind of fell off. So weeks 1 through 8 before his bye, he had 21, 6, 17, 10, 36, 23, 22, 25. In that stretch of time, he was the running back 2 behind Christian McCaffrey by 37 points. But he was the clear and away running back 2 in the league at that point. But then after his bye week, if we go to week 10 to 17 here, I'm trying to get the numbers right, but week 10 to 17 after his bye week, Travis Etienne drops all the way down to RB15 in that time, averaging 13.1 points per game. So he had 6, 8, 12, 17, 17, 9, 6, and 25 in that stretch of time. The 25-point game saving a lot of people in the fantasy championship if they had Travis Etienne. So he didn't produce like an RB1 down the stretch. Had some really good games, 17, 17, and 25 in that stretch of time, but he also had some really bad games, some bust games that didn't work out. So Etienne, definitely a dude that is a little bit more inconsistent, and he's a guy that I definitely am not drafting in my top 3 of the running back position next year. I would say he's probably going to fall somewhere between 5 and 9 for me because I do think he has it. But the PPR situation for him, which based on his skill set coming out of college, should have been a little bit more consistent with pass catching. And in PPR leagues, if you catch 5 passes a game, you're pretty consistent at the running back position. It's why guys like Alvin Kamara have been good for as long as they have, is because they can pass catch. Austin Ekeler as well. But, so I anticipated that out of ETN, but they haven't used that skill set a lot. He just was used on the ground, scored touchdowns. He was he was the dude that they gave the ball to on a regular basis. So very interesting for Travis Etienne. Very interesting season. I'm interested to see where he does end up falling in the rankings. If there is, I'm actually curious to see if there is some 2024 draft rankings here. We got some 2024 expert consensus draft rankings, but people don't have anything. They don't have any time on their hands. You know what I'm saying? They don't have any time on their hands. So right now he's being ranked as the RB7, which, like I said, that's probably where I would end up having him, anywhere between 5 and 9. But as I do my rankings and stuff like that, when we get closer to the regular season, I'll obviously have a lot more information on Travis Etienne and what his situation is. But he did have a good season. He was the RB2 in fantasy football. Another interesting guy that this is one of those guys that's going to be overhyped, because right now on the expert consensus for 2024, which is only, let's see, how many guys is in this list? 14 experts. So not a lot of people have added to this, but Raheem Mostert finished really high. But right now on this list, Raheem Mostert is way down. He's at RB28. So, he's more, to me, he's more liable at this point to be a dude that had a really good season. Like, he surprised, but he is older, and they have Devin Achane. So he's going to be one of those dudes that kind of has like a really good season and then fades into the darkness. I don't think that he is going to be a dude that you can use on a week-to-week basis for fantasy football. He might provide some RB2 performances, but I don't see what happened this year happening again for him. But he did have 17 points per game. He would have probably been the RB2 on the season if he played that last game. And who knows, maybe he comes out next year and does that. But I did want to bounce into 2022 and just talk about some guys that finished really high that probably shouldn't have. Ramondre Stevenson, RB7 last year. Tony Pollard was RB8. So in the top 12, there was a few guys that finished there. Josh Jacobs, who had a down year this year, finished as the RB3. Every year you have a couple of guys that shock and surprise us a little bit. James Conner was the RB5 back in 2021. Playoff Lenny was RB6. So, Cordero Patterson, RB9. So I think that's just what kind of happened here with Raheem Mostert. He kind of just came out of nowhere and was able to put together those performances. Through 17 weeks, he was the RB3 on the season. So great year for him. Breece Hall, this is one of the bright shining stars. So I think if I'm making rankings right now, just because of Travis Etienne's inconsistencies, I would say he's probably anywhere between 5 and 9. I think as soon as they get Aaron Rodgers back, to me, I think that he would probably move up into that top 3. Right now, the expert consensus has him as the RB2, which it doesn't surprise me at all. I would rather have Bijan Robinson, but we don't know what the coaching situation looks like there or what the offense is going to look like. So we'll kind of hold that and see what happens there. But yeah, no, Breece Hall is really, really good. He had 261 fantasy points this year. He did start the season off really slow, 15-9, 3-9, and then from weeks 5 all the way to week 17, he was a freaking rock star. He only had one real super bust game, and that was 2 points in week 15, which was the playoffs. But like I said, from week 5 all the way to week 17 for this guy, it puts him as the RB2 on the season, 231 fantasy points, 20 ahead of Travis Etienne. So really good season for Breece Hall. It was worth having him through the majority of the season, and if you did have him, you might have a chance at getting some things done. But you might have had some chance. You might have had a shot at getting some things done and winning a championship is what I meant to say. But yeah, no, he's really good. And I think with Aaron Rodgers, there could be more beneficial stuff. But I do think he's less inconsistent than Travis Etienne was. But I do think that as the season goes along for Breece, there's a good shot for him to with Aaron Rodgers to improve upon what he did and get maybe around 300 fantasy points next year, which no other running back besides Christian McCaffrey did this year. But as you look at these first 3 guys, they're all separated by 7 points or less. And so with that being said, there's a lot of room for error here. You notice, Travis Etienne, Raheem Mostert, Breece Hall, like all of these guys, really, they kind of controlled their backfields for most of the season, but they weren't able to touch Christian McCaffrey because they were probably only getting 60% of the touches. So, for Hall, I think he has the best shot of being an RB1 next year, probably outside of Christian McCaffrey. But because of the way the running back position is used, it just makes it a challenge. Another shocker, which this could be the Tony Pollard of 2022, 2023. Like, Tony Pollard finished as the RB7 or 8 last year and through 17 weeks. Kyron Williams here at 5 finished as the RB5. And dude had a spectacular season. And there should be an argument for this dude, especially if guys stick around and the Rams make some improvements on their offense and Matt Stafford's still here and he's still playing football for the team. there is an argument to be made that this player should be, based on the points per game total that he got on average, he should have been RB2 on the season, and he should have been where Christian McCaffrey was, like real close to him, probably around 340, 350 fantasy points. Finishes with 261, finishes as the RB5. But he had, this was his totals in the first half of the season. I picked him up off the waiver wire, had him, and I ended up trading him because I was nervous about his injury, which sucked for me. But he had 17, 28, 8, 27, 7, and then 21. So the first half of the season through 6 weeks, he was doing okay. He was the RB4 on the season. He was doing, that's actually more than okay. That's really good. And then he ended up getting hurt. And from week 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, so 5 straight weeks, he missed time because he went on IR. And then from weeks 12 all the way to 17, the dude just went bonkers. In that stretch of time, he was 6 points off of Christian McCaffrey in terms of points per game. In that stretch, he had 38, 20, 14, 24, 16, and 30, and he was a bona fide lock at RB2 overall. So really, really good stuff from Kyren Williams on the season. I think they have their guy, and they're going to run him into the ground. And back when they had, Todd Gurley, that's exactly what they did, and that's what they're going to do with Kyren Williams. I think that's exactly what they're going to do, and I would be totally okay with drafting him. I wish I had ADP for August right now so I could kind of project and predict what was going to happen. Right now, Kyren Williams is ranked as the RB4, which I think is a safe bet. I actually would say, if I had to rank guys right now, just as like a prerequisite, McCaffrey definitely going number 1. I would make Behan number 2. And then it would be a battle for 3 between Breece Hall and Kyren Williams. I'd probably give it to Breece just off of sheer talent. But, what Kyren Williams just did this year was absolutely insane. I don't know if he can follow it up next year. You know what I mean? This could be one of those guys that shocked, like Tony Pollard did last year with, being an RB7 even with Zeke. So, that could be what happens with Kyren Williams, but I just don't know. Next guy is Rachaad White. This is a very sneaky season for Rachaad White because you have guys like Travis Etienne who jumped up into the top 3. Mostert shocked everyone and ended up a top 3 running back. So, you ended up getting a shocking player there. Breece Hall, people were kind of anticipating that he wasn't going to be great on the season just because of his ACL injury. He does end up RB4, so he ends up really good. And then Kyren Williams shocks everyone. So it's like Raheem Mostert, Kyren Williams, I think, are the biggest shocks on this list. Etienne being as high as he is a shock. And then Breece Hall, I think, is a shock because I don't think a lot of people are looking at him in the 4th round because of his injuries. Very interesting. But Rachaad White sneaks himself here into the top 6. And finishes the season with 254 fantasy points. So he could have reasonably finished with, finishes the RB5. The biggest thing for him is that out of these top 6 running backs, McCaffrey had 24 points per game. Etienne had 16. Raheem Mostert had 17 points per game. And then you had Breece Hall with 16 points per game. And Kyren Williams had 21 points per game. But then you had Rachaad White, who was in that situation. He was close maybe to Breece Hall, averaged 15.9 points per game, but he had a decent season. He had 6 points week 1, 23, 7, 10, bye week, 6, 15, 17, 27, 17, 17, 13, 19, 21, 21, 19, and then 8 in week 17. So first half of the season really here, first 6 weeks of the season, he kind of had, I would say 4 bust games out of his first 5 games. And then after that midway point, or not midway point, when they started to enter the midway point, from week 7, really, all the way to week 17, Rachaad White just went bonkers. And in that stretch of time, he was RB1 in that stretch of time, RB2 in that stretch of time. Couple points off of, I think it was 42 points off of Christian McCaffrey, but finishing those games with 18.3 points per game. The only guy that had a higher points per game total than him was Jahmyr Gibbs, and he tied with Breece Hall in this stretch of games. So really good stuff from Rachaad White in an offense that really didn't seem like they could run the ball super effectively. He's a guy to keep an eye on. I would probably put him anywhere between 8 and 12 in my rankings. The expert consensus right now has Rachaad White right at 8. I don't know if I can put him that high. because I don't know if I can trust him, but it looks like Tampa's been looking for their running back, and they finally get him with Rashad White. Moving on is Joe Mixon. So a lot of these guys younger, like Rashad White younger, Kyron Williams younger, Breece Hall younger, Mostert's old, Travis Etienne younger, Christian McCaffrey on the older side. So like we're starting to get some of the new guard of running backs jumping into the top 10 so that we know over the next couple years what these guys are going to be, and we have a little bit more understanding. I felt like this year there are so many older running backs that finished high last year that you were like, are they going to finish high this year? What's going to happen? So you see some of that stuff go on. But, anyway, so Joe Mixon's the first really, I would say, older running back here besides Christian McCaffrey that finishes in the top 12. He was good this year. But he wasn't great. He had some moments where he busted, and he had like 3 or 4 weeks where he scored under 10 points, have 15.1 points per game. So he's been just a steady Eddie, consistent guy. I don't know if he's under contract with Cincinnati, but if he leaves the team, I don't think he's going to be an RB1 next year. If he is the RB1 for Cincinnati next year, I don't think he can finish in the top 12. I do think that if you're looking for a solid like RB2 or somebody that can play in your second flex, your first flex, or your second running back, Joe Mixon's the dude. But I just don't think he's going to be able to come back next year and be a top 10 running back. Consensus right now has Joe Mixon somewhere around RB19. So that is, like I said, that's exactly where I'd probably have him, somewhere in that vicinity. But that's Joe Mixon. So he had a good season, but, interesting stuff. Moving down the list, shocking, Alvin Kamara, the bona fide G who continues to play well. He goes on a 3-week suspension and then comes out and scores 21, 18, 17, 29, 27, 11, 18, bye week, 15, 28, 13, 16, and then busts the last 2 weeks of the regular season, averaging 17, almost 18 points per game with 233 fantasy points. If you go from weeks 4 to 17, which is the stretch of time that he played this year after his suspension was lifted, and Alvin Kamara was a top 3 running back. So if you drafted him and you waited, you got a stud. I actually didn't think, because of all the stuff that was going on, I didn't think Kamara was going to be a great, but he ended up being a good buy. And maybe some of those dudes that you're not sure about or that are suspended early in the season, it might be worth the investment, because Kamara came in and was really good. I think a lot of people thought Kendre Miller was going to come in and be the dude, which is kind of what I thought. But obviously, Alvin Kamara does that. I did skip over somebody. So Alvin Kamara is the RB9. Jahmyr Gibbs is the RB8. So let's get into that after I finish Alvin Kamara. But yeah, so 233 fantasy points, really good. Another older running back that I don't know can continue into next year. I would say he's probably between the 15 and 20 range as well. And right now he's 14, on the expert consensus. So, just keep an eye on Alvin Kamara. He's not a guy I'm going to be targeting next year. There's a lot of younger running backs that I'd rather try to go after. That are going to be a little bit lower. But if you're into that, like you just need a steady Eddie running back, like I said earlier, use the cliches over and over again, you can go with Alvin Kamara. But Jahmyr Gibbs, this is the new Alvin Kamara. First 7 weeks of the season, we've heard the stories on this kid. 16.6 points per game on the season, 233 fantasy points. So he finished actually with 233.1, which is why he's one spot ahead of Alvin Kamara. Missed 2 weeks in weeks 5 and 6, and he started the first 4 weeks of the season with 8, 12, 9, and 9. So basically 4 bust games to start the season. A lot of people, I had a dude who offered, and I wish I had taken the trade because I knew it was going to happen, but he offered me a trade. I think it was actually Rick that offered me a trade with him, and it was basically chicken scraps. And I was like, I don't know, and I kind of hesitated because he was having a bad season. And, he comes out after week 6 and just lights it up. Gets 27, 29, 26, 21, 11, 6, 17, 24, 24, and then 5. So still inconsistent, but from week 7 all the way to week 17, he was an RB3 in that stretch of time. So once he got started, he was really good, and it got him to number 8 at the running back position. If he starts a full season next year, sorry, I was taking a drink if you're listening on podcasts. But if the dude starts every game next year and he gets the workload that he got from week 7 all the way to 17, this guy is going to be a monster running back, and I would rank him in my top 5 if I had the opportunity. And right now, Jahmyr Gibbs is number 5 at the running back position in fantasy football. I think he's a bona fide, RB1, and I think he can finish way higher than where he was. If he in the first 6 weeks of the season played like he did in the second half of the season with those averages, from week 7 to 17, where he was averaging about 19.4 points per game. If he did that the whole season, you're talking about a running back that falls, ends up at RB2 on the year. So Gibbs is going to be one of the hottest commodities in fantasy football. I would take Gibbs even over maybe Kyron Williams, just because I think Gibbs is that good, and I think he's going to be really good going into 24. We obviously just talked about Alvin Kamara. He finishes at 9. And then we have Derrick Henry. This is it for Henry. He's 30. He's going to be 31 next year, I believe. So it's going to be challenging for Derrick Henry to get himself into that position to have success. He did have a lot of bust games. He had games under 10 points. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games under 10 points, 5 out of 17 weeks. He played every game this season again, and had a really decent year, 14 points per game. I don't think he's going to finish in the top 12 again. I think he'll probably be right around 10 to 12 fantasy points per game next year, which will probably drop him into the vicinity of, running backs like, like you can slide into your top flex or your second running back slot, which I'm okay with. Like, if you want to get more of a steady running back that gets those points, that's what you might go with. But Vrabel's gone. It looks like a new coaching staff is probably going to come in, and we got to see what the offensive system looks like. A guy that I would keep an eye on going into 2024 would be his backup, Tajay Spears, because Spears looked really good in limited action this year. I kept him on my fantasy team all year in case of Derrick Henry getting injured. I think Henry will still get a bulk of the carries, but I think sometime next year, Tajay Spears is going to be, taking over that backfield. If not, them getting rid of Derrick Henry to move on, because he is a little bit on the older side. NFL teams tend to like to, move on from players before it's too late. But he did finish with 225 fantasy points. He was 5 points off from 2 other guys, so he could have finished at RB13 if he didn't score 5 more fantasy points on the season, which he did. But really good season for Derrick Henry if you had him, very consistent. The playoff game in Week 16 helped my brother win a fantasy championship in the home league again. So 21 points in Week 16 got him the championship, but Henry was good for a majority of the season, just had a lot of bust games, and he's a lot more inconsistent than normal. So makes him an RB2 at this point to me. And just looking at the rankings real quick, just to talk about it, Henry is now RB21, so he's way down on the list. He's going to be probably going to be a 5th, 6th round pick. So, he might be a dude that you can get on your team and maybe get some good performances, but you got to see what happens in the offseason. If he leaves the Titans, he's going to go the way of the dodo, like, Dalvin Cook or other guys. James Cook, RB11, another young guy that's got a lot of promise. I still don't think the Bills run the ball super well with him, but he did have a really good season this year. Finished with 224 fantasy points, averaged 14 points per game, played every single game, so that was good for him. But like I said, he's kind of in the same boat of Derrick Henry this year. 5, 7, 3, 4, 5, 6 bust games. He had 6 games under 10 points, so not good for James Cook. He was a good flex, I guess, this year, but finishes at RB11. And when you get this far down the list in terms of the running back position, it just starts to get a little bit more inconsistent. But yeah, you see really good things from James Cook. I if you're asking me where I think I'm gonna rank him next year, I would say anywhere from 8 to 12 is probably safe. If the Bills are good offensively, they're probably going to be fine. But right now, the expert consensus has James Cook at 13. So, he's kind of in that vicinity. He's kind of in that range. He's a little bit more unpredictable, and you don't know what's going to happen. The Bills could go in the draft and draft a running back in the second round or the first round, and that would just completely destroy James Cook. So we'll have to see what happens with him, but he was good. Bijan Robinson comes in, finishes an RB12. Keeping with the streak of these first-round running backs that get drafted being RB1s for their football team, you got to stick with that streak. Bijan Robinson finishes RB12. He finished with 13.8 points per game and a 220 fantasy points, so he was safely in the top 12 here at the running back position. But he did come away with a ton of bust games. He had 3 bust games, and he was consistently around 10 fantasy points, but the Atlanta Falcons just used him in such odd ways that it kind of like damaged his production. So, to me, when I look at him, I want to see what the next coach that comes in is probably going to drive the ball into his hands a million times, even if it's Bill Belichick. This is a highly drafted, prospect. They're going to get him the ball as much as possible. It's not going to be Arthur Smith screwing around anymore. It's going to be Bijan Robinson getting the ball. So he's got to be a guy like I said, he's in my top 5, definitely, maybe even in my top 3, because I think he's got all the talent in the world and he's really good. The expert consensus right now is Bijan at 3, so it makes sense for him to be there. But I don't know. Do you count this as a breakout season? He's an RB1. I think he's a lot better than RB12. So I think he'll be really good. One of the surprises was Isaiah Pacheco. He averaged 15 points per game, finished with 213, and was the RB13, so just outside of the top 12. If he had played all 16 games, which he missed week 14 and 15, I think there would have been, and I'm just going into extra guys now because I was only going to talk about the top 12. We are 33 minutes into this episode, so I'll blow through some more guys, see if we can get to like 20 to 24. But Pacheco finished the season, really strong with a 10, 25, 21, 10, and 29 point games, but he did miss week 14 and 15, which kind of pushed him down the rankings. I think he probably would have been top 10 at the running back position, but he was very inconsistent. First 2 games of the season, he had 2 bust games, 9 and 8, and then he had 6 and 6 in weeks 8 and 9, so that puts him at 4 bust games. But outside of that, he had 10 or more every single week. So outside of the 2 games that he missed, so just if you had him, you had basically 2 weeks where you didn't have him and 4 weeks that were busts. So it's about 6 out of the 11 weeks that you would have played him that weren't really good, which doesn't show good signs for me. I think he's probably for me, I don't want to rank him in the top 12. I probably would have him between 12 and 15 if I was ranking him. And he is 11 on the expert consensus, so they're a little bit higher on him than I am. I'm probably going to have him down 4 or 5 more spots, but Pacheco was good this year. I'll give it to him. Pollard finishes RB13, definitely going to have him in the 20s. I have no interest in having Tony Pollard on my football team. He had so many busts this year. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 busts on the season. 7 out of 10 weeks, he was a bust. He did play every game, and he did have some good stretches of games, but man, it was just I had him on my team for most of the fantasy season. It was a pain in the butt to have him. I did not enjoy it in the slightest. Jerome Ford scored as many fantasy points as he did, so I would imagine Dallas goes into the offseason and looks for a running back. And drafts one relatively high, and Pollard ends up being the second guy again. If they don't move in a different direction with Pollard, then, he might be a good option next year, but I think as the things currently stand, he'll be anywhere between 18 and 22 for me in rankings. Jerome Ford, he is completely worthless. He might get a role next year at the running back position, but Nick Chubb will most likely be back, and the expert consensus, I would put him in the RB2, RB3 range. And the expert consensus right now is Nick Chubb at 23 and Jerome Ford at 35. So yeah, he's in the running back 4 area for them, RB3 or 4 if you're counting that. But so Jerome Ford had a really good little season if you picked him up, but at the end of the day, Nick Chubb will probably be back week 1 next year, and he's not going to be relevant for fantasy football. Saquon Barkley had an interesting season. He did have, 1, 2, 3, 4 bust games, and he missed 3 weeks. So 7 weeks, he wasn't really producing anything for you, but he did finish the season with 15 points per game. If we take week 6 to 17, just to give you a sample size, when he came back from his injury, Saquon Barkley was RB9, so he was still a top 12 running back in fantasy football production-wise. But the freaking Giants were so bad that it wasn't good. So, when you look at things with him, it's really tough. But Barkley finishes RB16. He's probably going to definitely be in my top 10. I just don't know where. I think I would probably be anywhere from 6 to 10 is where I would rank him. Barkley right now is ranked on the expert consensus. He is ranked as RB9. So that does make sense. But we'll have to see what the Giants do. If the Giants go out and get a quarterback, or the Giants go out and make some actual moves to try to push the team in a positive direction, because they're a feisty team. They're not good. They don't have enough talent at receiver. They don't have enough talent at in the offensive line, they don't have enough talent at quarterback really to make things happen. And it seems like they're going back to Daniel Jones. Maybe that helps him next year. Maybe that helps Saquon Barkley because of the dual threat approach that they have with the quarterback. But we just don't know. But Barkley just he got off to a hot start with, he busted with the 9 points, but week 2 he had 27, so it looked like he was just going to get back on track, and he had a tough start to the season. But 3 weeks in, getting an injury, just not positive for him. So, but I do think he's definitely a top 10 running back in fantasy football. So, if you're looking for a top 10 guy, you got to get him on your team. DeAndre Swift started so hot, and it collapsed quickly for him. So week 1, he had 1 point, busted. And then just to count the bust games, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games under 10 points. So that's what you get when you're getting an RB17. You're definitely going to get 9, 10, 7 to 10 bust games. But in the first part of the season, he had 1, 27, 14, 17, 16, 17, 10, 14, and he looked really good. Through that stretch of games, through week 8, you were looking at DeAndre Swift as a top 5 running back in fantasy football. Like, he was putting up really good numbers, had a really good season. Things were going really, really well for him. And then that back half of the season really killed DeAndre Swift. I almost traded for him, and I decided not to. But from weeks 12 all the way to 17, that's when the Eagles started to kind of collapse a little bit, DeAndre Swift just dropped off a freaking cliff and finishes the RB31 in that stretch of time, averaging 8 points per game. So he was just not great in that stretch of time. Swift to me is an RB2/RB3 at this point. He's being ranked right now at RB25, so that makes sense, right? Just outside of the top 24. He might be a little bit higher than that, but I don't know what's going on with the Eagles. They could change offenses. Things could go in a negative direction. I just don't know. But Swift had a good start, bad finish. Inconsistent. I don't know if I love that pick, but if he's a little bit later in your draft, when August floats around, it might be a good idea. David Montgomery started off the season real good. He did miss week 3, but first 4 games he played, 13, 12, 34, 20. And then he had 4 points where I believe he got hurt in week 6, and then he missed 2 more weeks. After the bye week, he was still good, 17, 17, 15, 12, 11, 10, 14, 12. So didn't really have any bust games, averaged 15 points per game. Produced well for the most part. I mean, if you look at that second half of the season from week 10 on, I would say he's probably mid RB2, high-end RB2, which David Montgomery was RB9 in that stretch of times from week 10 to 17. So when he was healthy and on the field, this dude was a G, averaging that 15 points per game. So he's a guy you definitely had to keep your eye on. I think he's going to be in the range of RB10 to 20 if I had to guess. And right now he's RB18. So that's kind of where I would put him. I'd put him right around 18 to 20 and call it a day. He's going to be more of a consistent, they give the ball to him on the goal line. Like, he's going to be a consistent dude next year, and you can slap him in your RB2 slot or your first flex and kind of just get consistent point output every single week. A couple more guys. Kenneth Walker finishes 190 fantasy points. Started the season well, 10, 18, 30, 13, bye week 17, 13. And then after that, it was 8, 2, 19, 2, 9, 20, 6, 16. So a lot of inconsistent situations. Seattle's going to have a new coach this year, so it should be interesting to see where things go for that. But the first, I want to say 6 to 7 games of the season for him, he was actually really good and produced effectively. So I don't know what we're going to do with Kenneth Walker, but we'll wait to see where the approach is. I don't know where I'm going to rank him until I know where that situation goes. Jaylen Warren surprised this year, finishing higher than Najee Harris, who was RB27. Jaylen Warren finishes RB20 and had some decent games. He averaged 11 points per game, but he was just consistently on the field every single week. 188 fantasy points, so there's a massive drop-off between the last 2 guys in the RB18. But, yeah, so Jaylen Warren's a guy to keep an eye on. I just don't know what that football team is going to do with Najee and him and, all of that stuff. But I didn't anticipate Jaylen Warren being really good. Sometimes maybe you got to listen to those camp reports. Brian Robinson Jr. finished with 21. This guy is always going to be a bona fide RB2, somewhere in that range, maybe dropping into RB3. If I had to rank him, it would be low-end RB3, probably in the 30s. Right now he's RB29. So... yeah, he's in a situation right now where I just don't love Brian Robinson. I I think he's just a steady Eddie running back and doesn't really provide any juice for the team. Gus Edwards finishes RB22. Really the only consistent Baltimore Ravens running back here. Surprising that he finished as high as he did. He averaged 11 points per game. Played in basically every game. Was very inconsistent, but did have a stretch in the middle of the season where he had 21, 29, 17, and really carried you. In the playoffs, he had 13, 14, 10. So he was okay. Scored touchdowns, did his thing, but he's older, and I think Baltimore would probably either go with not Justice Hill, the fast guy they just drafted, whose name escapes me. Either go with him or draft a guy. Josh Jacobs had a really strong fall from grace, even before he left the game in week 14. From weeks 1 through 12, this dude was cooking. And he was actually pretty good. Josh Jacobs was RB4, so he still had it. But second half of the season, he got hurt after the bye week, and that was it with Josh Jacobs. Finishes the RB23, averaging 13 points per game. So he probably should have finished in the top 10, but did not, obviously, because he missed week 15, 16, and 17, and then got hurt in week 13 and only had a 7-point game. Outside of that, realistically, he was okay. Just had a tough start to the season. And then the final guy that we'll discuss, maybe we'll talk about 25, but Austin Ekeler comes in here Devin Etienne comes in here at RB24, and it's stunning that he was even in the conversation of RB24 because he missed weeks 1 inactive, and then he got hurt and missed week 6, 7, 8, 9 bye week. Came back for 2 plays, got hurt again, and then missed 12. So basically, weeks 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, he did not play. And then he came back from his injury and got 23, 12, 9, 4, and 23 again. So looking at his average points per game, he definitely had his share of busts. Week 2, I don't even count as a game. And the reason why he was so high is because of a 51-point game. But he had week 3, 4, and 5, he had 51, 27, 21. And then when he came back from injury, he basically had 25, 12, and then he had 9, 4, and 23. So, that stretch of games from week 13 to 17, which we can kind of I'm going to punch that in just to see where he finished. I would guess it's top 12. Devin Etienne finishes RB10 in that stretch of games. So he's going to be an interesting guy to see where he lands because I think a lot of people are probably going to rank him in the top 12. I would probably rank him anywhere between 10 and 15. It's a wide range, I know. But the expert consensus right now has Devin Etienne at 10. And I think in that offense, if he gets the full workload, it is going to be extremely interesting for a guy like, Devin Etienne. I'm interested to see where his career develops. He's wicked fast. So if he gets the Mostert workload, he could be a top 10 running back or top 3-4 running back in fantasy football and shock us. And I am predicting that. I think if you're going to choose a guy that could have a massive breakout, it's him. All right. And then the final guy, Austin Ekeler. I've talked about this before. He had 26 points week 1, missed 3 games, then had 10, 5, 23, 21, 21. So it was looking like he was coming back, and he had 7, 9, 4, 21, 7, 11, and 4. I was going to say 14, but he had 4. He averaged 13 points per game, 173 fantasy points. So he didn't have a horrible year in terms of fantasy points, but I think he's buns. I think he's done. I think he's out. I don't think he's going to be able to win anymore. And I think Austin Ekeler is done. I don't know how much time he's got left in LA, but I think LA is going to look in a different direction. And Austin Ekeler, even if he's there next year, I think they're gonna move forward without him and go from there. So very interesting to see what happened this year at the running back position. We've got some guys that I'm super hype about. I'm not even gonna joke. I love Devin Etienne. I love Etienne. I like Kyron Williams. I really like Breece Hall and Jahmyr Gibbs next year. James Cook is intriguing to me now that he had a really good season. There's some other guys that kind of came out in the second half, didn't really perform too well. Was Kenneth Walker's in that conversation. So I'm curious to see where things go, and how things go. Tajay Spears is another guy. I didn't talk about him. He's RB34 this year, but I think he could have a chance of being really good. You also have Jonathan Taylor out there floating around in the hemisphere, averaging 14 points per game, but missing a lot of the season. So we're going to have to see what happens with some of these guys, but it's been a very interesting NFL season, and I'm not breaking down quarterbacks. I'm not really going to break down tight ends. But yeah, there you go. 2023 is in the books, fam. We are going to start talking about some real 2024 content coming up. It's going to be an interesting season. can't wait for the drafts. If you haven't followed us, follow us on all social platforms. Like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. We'll talk to you later, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Champions Podcast. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, and follow us on Twitter @TheFFChamps.